social justice thinking that this is not irreversible by other forces, right? As well. So,
yeah, no, of course. I mean, that's sort of, yeah. Yeah, what I just wanted to say is that, I mean, well, it kind of depends on how seriously you are taking this opposition at the moment. But I'm kind of, for the most part, I'm taking it as noise and as something that is kind of trying to stop the train, but has so far been successful in slowing it down, not stopping it. I'm not saying it's inevitable that they will never be able to stop the train, but they're not winning. They're still on the losing side, and the pro-environment is still on the winning side. But of course, in principle, anything can happen. But it's just sometimes I think it's good to realize that when especially as a social movement kind of actor, when you face very strong opposition from people who hold very strong power positions, to kind of realize that, okay, on this environment thing, the movements are still kind of winning. In the big picture, the movements are still winning, and the people who are the opponents are still losing. That might turn, and yeah. Any time at the movements need to keep on pushing, the train won't move by itself. It needs an engine, but still.
Yeah, and there's still political allies that are often at the city level or regional level, even when you have a Bolsonaro or a Trump at the national level that you can't deal with, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I will jump in here as well. So, I mean, there's the political rhetoric and the Trumps and Bolsonaros of the world, but then there are also the corporations, and if you follow the money, so part of another side project of that I do in my research is to look at sustainable finance and to look at where companies are putting their monies and their investments in. You do see that very clear shift towards environmental issues being taken into consideration at a very serious level. I think the green bonds, they're growing. They're still a very small segment of the global bond market, but it is a growing market, and it's one of the most promising, fastest growing segment of the bond market. There's increasingly talk, or rather there's increasing interest among sovereign wealth funds and pension funds into shifting their investments away from the oil, the fossil fuel industries into the more greener activities and the more sustainable industries. The whole idea of ESG, which is environment and social governance, being taken seriously in the way financial institutions are evaluated and audited. It's becoming increasingly internalized as an industry norm. So if you look at where the money is, if you look at the financial sector, despite the political rhetoric, finance at least is really taking it seriously, and they're really starting to look at how climate change is impacting business continuity, how climate change is impacting supply chains, and the insurability of various large corporations. So yeah, I'll just
and I'd say even within the oil sector too, we see one of the piece I have forthcoming now in energy research and social science, kind of challenging this idea of the oil sector as like one big homogenous block, right? Like, so they're often the kind of the big bad of climate change. They're an easy villain, but there is also some very meaningful diversity and heterogeneity, to the point where I think other researchers, not myself, have pointed out that companies who are headquartered in Europe tend to take climate change much more seriously than companies headquartered in North America, because they're responding to the signals of public pressure. They're responding to the signals of policy in the EU versus North America. But the energy research social science paper I have looks at different fields of operating fields, looking at Norway, Scotland, and Atlantic Canada. And there we really see that the Norwegian field, yeah, is way more attentive to these kind of discussions that Catherine's talking about, very much more forward-looking and embracing the kind of logic of, okay, transforming finance, transforming the business model, whereas Scotland, the thinking there is a bit more just how do we keep our oil sector solvent and operating in the coming decades as the political landscape changes around climate change. And here in Atlantic Canada, it's really still a discourse of not skepticism, but of avoidance, right? Of saying like, yeah, oil's going to come back. This is not something we really need to worry about. If anything, climate change means fewer icebergs off our coasts and safer operating spaces and all that. So even within the, what we often think of as the big bad sector, there's this really meaningful diversity between, I feel like, the Norwegian sector that's much more thinking along the lines Catherine just talked about, to, North America, where things are maybe not that forward thinking, and where there needs to be more pressure put to bear by the public, by social movements to shift companies thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, certainly. That's a good point, and it's another sort of example of the same thing. I think are Finnish, or sort of the same thing, Finnish forestry corporations. So some of the world's largest forestry corporations are headquartered here and operate here, and they operate around the world. And so my impression of what these companies are doing is they're kind of playing two sets of cards at the same time, or they're playing in two tables at the same time. With one hand, they are playing this game where they're very strongly branding themselves as so one of them is now called themselves a bio-4 company, whatever that's supposed to mean, but it's like whatever, a bioeconomy thing where they use wood to just not just do pulp and paper and wood products, but they use it for all kinds of new high-tech things that we need, and they very much portray this image like they buy front pages of newspapers to do this, and they've kind of structured their entire corporate communication around this idea that they are greening up, and to some extent that's true. They have some really good, ambitious pro-environment projects, but at the same time they're playing with this other hand within these policy networks that I talked about to influence the government to not act quite too quickly, because at the same time they're making money from cutting down trees that could be carbon sinks, and they are using a lot of electricity. Pulp factories use enormous amounts of electricity, so they contribute to climate change happening, and I don't really I'm not saying they're even insincere. I think they if they were given the choice today to say, okay, just change all your business green and just play with the green part of things and forget everything else, they probably would be happy to do that if they could make the same money with that, but they can't yet. So they're kind of taking the dirty, bad for climate money and trying to use it to transform themselves for the future. And so what Mark was saying between about the different kinds of oil companies taking different sides on this, I think there are different sides within the same company also in some respects, and it's being contested there. And I think one sort of point of leverage for social movements or anyone who is interested in environmental action is to kind of try to help those companies in that transition process, and yes, denounce whatever they do badly, but also kind of very much encourage them to make this transition, and sort of and of course put pressure on them too by showing wherever they do dirty stuff and encourage them to do the clean stuff at the same time. Yeah.
Great. Maybe at this point, well, we don't have any questions yet from the audience, so I'm very welcoming different questions on the topics of discussion. But I thought maybe to maybe give a little bit of the Slovenian context. We were discussing kind of feels like, you know, with the current discourse that we're back in the 70s kind of debating economy versus environment, or, you know, which one do we choose? And it's maybe very apparent in the new kind of push of government, which just managed to pass a law in majority, kind of limiting NGOs from participating, several NGOs from participating, and a few other factors kind of benefiting a lot of investors and people invested in like very particular energy projects, for example. So yeah, I think here in Slovenia, and especially the movement and wider civil society has a lot of questions, on their mind in terms of this process and like the nexus of because there's also from higher government been, you know, public discreditations of public media and things like this. So yeah, really a kind of specific context to be working in. Of course, it's very difficult to kind of apply your kind of analyses on this, which you don't have that much information on, but still, I'd be very interested, for example, to maybe hear from Catherine, like we discussed before the stream, a little bit the kind of how to kind of structure public risk communication in a certain sense, and how to and contextualize, right, that there's also open discussions or very polemic discussions currently around nuclear energy infrastructure, and past projects, energy projects are also kind of wound up in different kind of corruption scandals and such. So it's lots of different takes and opinions on the subject, but not a lot of efforts to structure communication education wise to kind of not only risk of nuclear per se, but contextualizing the whole national question of going into nuclear or not, or additional nuclear, given that all we have to go on in terms of these assessment is the actual assessments being done, right, of, you know, ecological assessments of the technologies themselves, but also in terms of the breadthness of the scenarios we have in terms of what kind of pathways we can take as a society, and kind of post-growth scenarios are, of course, grossly underrepresented in these types of scenarios, where you could, you know, anticipate big changes in terms of like the whole metabolism of energy and resources when you know, have something like a fair sharing economy for certain segments, and so on. So yeah, maybe Catherine, and also open for all of you, like a question on essentially structuring public discourse or civic media to kind of handle these tasks, maybe in the institutional support and involvement at play.
Okay, so I think there are many different angles you can approach this question, whether it's, you know, is nuclear energy viable or not, or whether it's climate policy viable or not. The reality is, you know, climate policy, much like nuclear energy policy, it has, depending on how it's being implemented, it has positive and negative consequences, right? So if you were to approach both questions from the with this framing question of, is this policy going to increase or create new inequalities as your anchoring point, right? So is climate policy going to create or increase increase or create new inequalities? It does. It can, depending on how it is being implemented, right? And this is why it's been politicized by right-wing, conservative parties. When you approach a question, when you try to communicate to the public about climate change or climate policy, I mean, okay, let's take a step back. I really don't like this starting a conversation from saying we need to communicate with the public, right? Because it assumes that the public doesn't know better, and I, as the expert, knows better. But actually, we don't. The whole point of risk communication or public communication is to understand from the public's perspective, what is it that they're concerned about? How does this particular climate policy impact them? Is it going to cause them to lose their jobs? Is it going to impact livelihoods? Is it going to increase the cost of their utility bills, right? So all of those things have to be taken into consideration. And then you have a public debate about if these are the negative consequences of a good policy, like climate policy, for example. How do we then mitigate those negative consequences, right? Then you can have a pragmatic discussion, a public dialogue about what is the best way to design this particular policy, and what is the best way to implement it, causing the least amount of harm to the population as a whole, and taking into consideration the kind of inequalities you're going to create. So good policy can increase inequalities, which would then make it bad policy, right? So you really need to have that kind of public debate about it. Now, when you talk about nuclear energy, it's the same principle. Is nuclear energy going to increase or create new inequalities in my country, right? And then have that debate. It can actually reduce inequalities if this industry is going to create more jobs, better paying jobs for people, if it is going to reduce electricity bills, if it is going to improve energy security for the country. But then you also have to consider, what about the waste? Can the government or the nuclear industry ensure that this nuclear power plant will be operated up to the best standards of safety? Who's going to ensure the nuclear power plant? If a nuclear accident does happen, who's going to be responsible for it? Who's going to pay for the cost? How is the cost going to be covered? Right? So there are a lot of, and are those risks acceptable to the public? So we cannot assume that the public automatically considers any possible risk as unacceptable. The acceptability of risk is something that is subjective and therefore needs to be discussed, and cannot be taken unilaterally by the government or by the private sector, for example. So this is what I mean by communication and the dialogue that needs to happen. And we cannot always just assume that good policy is good for the public or the country as a whole, or that what has been painted as a bad technology would naturally have negative consequences, and only negative consequences for the country. So going back to the nuclear example, there are examples of nuclear energy being operated in a very safe and equitable manner, where the ownership of the power plant is owned by the community and not by a majority share by the private sector. So this again changes the whole configuration of governance of the particular nuclear power plant or the industry in that country. So they're very different models, and they're good models and they're bad models, right? So yeah, so I'll stop it there and let other people jump in.
Sure. And maybe I'll jump in just thinking particularly about, I guess, the current state with COVID and the kind of state of exigencies that governments are kind of trying to operate in right now. And I think what we're seeing, so I think one thing reading about the current situation in Slovenia, I was surprised because I think one thing that the Aarhus Convention you hear much more about in European countries than you do in North America. In North America, people really don't know much about it at all. But I asked Rox, like, doesn't that kind of contradict the Aarhus Convention to start excluding environmental groups and civil society from decision making about major projects or input into major projects? It's like, yeah, it does. And it's like, okay, well, that would be one lever, I guess, to kind of rally around. It's like, hey, like the Aarhus Convention there says this, right? And you're in breach of that. Make that very public in the public discourse. But I think what we're seeing right now in Canada with the kind of COVID state of exigency is that the public discourse is really contested around things like oil development and green transitions and climate change. It's really shifted in the last few months with COVID. And on one hand, you have the oil dependent regions like Alberta or my province in Newfoundland and Labrador that really want to see kind of a weakening of environmental assessment requirements right now under the rubric of reducing risk because of COVID. You really want to see like calls for federal bailouts of the oil sector, of kind of emergency funding for the sector to kind of try and reboot the sector that's losing money from COVID, plus just the tanking oil prices globally that are related to that. And then you have the government of Alberta. There's been some major contestation around pipeline projects, new pipeline development, and the government of Alberta saying, well, now is a perfect time to start building pipelines, to get shovels in the ground, because the protesters will all be at home on lockdown, right? So people are actually not going to be able to mobilize against it. So this is a perfect time to start pushing through new oil development. By contrast, though, there's a counter discourse of green recovery that has been, I think, a really powerful rallying point, just that phrase and what that might mean for activists, for researchers and academics, and also for cities. So for example, the city of Vancouver, which is a C40 group city, kind of climate friendly city, all that stuff. So building alliances across civil society, kind of university communities and cities and other governments, provincial governments, to say, no, like whatever recovery plan happens right now has to be a green recovery. If there's any financial money for the oil sector or airline industry, for example, it has to be tied to concrete plans for how they're going to engage in decarbonization and low carbon transitions, right? So I think that is a very contested space here in Canada right now. But that's been one way that civil society is trying to shape the discourse, is to take the kind of green recovery framework of looking at the current moment.
Yeah, I think this green recovery theme is really interesting. We just had a good discussion with it about someone who's heading the climate change panel here in Finland, which is the sort of official body of scientists giving advice to the government on climate change, and so there's an interesting report, for example, that just came out from a bunch of Oxford economists, including, or it came out in an Oxford series, but it had like people like Joe Stiglitz and what's his name, Niklas Stern, and sort of famous economists, and they had surveyed a bunch of people around the world, not like social movement activists necessarily, or like any kind of ecologically minded people per se. They were surveying people from ministries of finance and from big banks and these kind of things, and they gave them a series of proposals for COVID recovery, and asked them to rate them in a scale where they should indicate how feasible it is, how good it is for the environment, and how good it is for the economy. And so these people collectively identified a bunch of initiatives that are can be done very quickly. That can be done using the money that the governments are doing to restart the economies anyway. So it's not like even extra spending, it's the spending that will have to be done anyway as stimulus spending. So you could spend that money either, by building pipelines like they want to do in Alberta, which is not a smart thing for the environment, or you could spend that money in things like and it's not even like new super high-tech stuff. It's like better thermal insulation for buildings and better heating system retrofits and these kind of things. There's a lot of potential in this very simple kind of things that can be done, and it doesn't require training of people. It doesn't require, it's not, it's quick, it's relatively cheap, it's very good for the environment, and it's good stimulus. So those kind of policies do exist, and they could be chosen by any government at the moment. But for some reason, some governments or most governments may not be choosing these policies. So that's something really that really should be done. And it also has to do with the fact that I guess this may not be news to anyone listening to this, but it might be to someone. So I'm gonna say it again. It is much more expensive not to act on climate change than it is to act on climate change, and this is something that economists also very much agree on. There are estimates that if we don't do anything about climate change, it's going to cost us about 5 to 10% of the global GDP per year. If we do all the necessary measures to limit global warming at 1.5, that will cost us 2 to 5% of global GDP per year. So it's actually much cheaper to act than to just wait for the disaster and repair it afterwards. And this is something that should be kept in mind all the time, especially now that governments are going into a lot of debt for COVID stimulus, and they have the opportunity of kind of taking the cheaper bill on the climate issue and using the same COVID money to pay for that cheaper bill. Or they can use the COVID money for something else and then be faced with the more expensive bill on climate, which is the stupid thing to do. So it's very important to push for this green recovery plan right now.
Yeah, I think that's becoming very topical in Slovenia as well. With there are many major research, basic research, and all kinds of things needing these kind of financing schemes, and as you mentioned, all sorts of projects and sustainable building renewal, etc. Yeah. Well, I thought maybe since we have Mark here, could pick your brain on this new policy by government to give each citizen 200 euros to spend on tourism at home as a kind of provision to keep tourism in country and kind of restart the economy, or whatever that means in this context. But of course, it's not being conceptually approached as an opportunity for a different concept of socio-ecological well-being or anything of the sort. But I think it would be very interesting to get your take on a kind of through your critical and kind of applicative research, seen different ways in which this can play out to actually contribute to local communities.
Yeah, and tourism is an interesting one, right? And I think we tend to have either in tourism host communities either a very positive or very negative view of it, as either a tool that can be used for community sustainability, or just a very economistic view of it as kind of an income generator, economic diversification, or the view that it really just kind of transforms places and turns them into kind of a caricature of themselves that's just for visitors. So that, I think it's a lot more complex than that. So a lot of my work is really to point out that it's a lot of it is about governance often, which doesn't get nearly as much attention as tourism promotion and marketing. And I think if you just throw out money and take a very economistic view, you don't necessarily build the models of tourism that are good for social ecological well-being that actually, I think actually I was attending a tourism session here yesterday, and one of our local tourism operators, Zita Cobb, I think was saying, forms of tourism that bring dignity to the visitor and dignity to the host, right? And I thought that was a really beautiful way of putting a more community-based or more sustainable form of tourism rather than just an economistic version. One thing COVID has really demonstrated is how fragile tourism economies are, how much they're bound up with this system of hypermobility that's very carbon intensive, that we've really taken for granted, particularly since the end of the Cold War, since the kind of wave of globalization in the 1990s. We've really taken this hypermobility for granted. And COVID has really shown that it's actually kind of a very fragile economy in some ways, right? And so I think it gives us maybe a chance to rethink the kinds of models of tourism we want for our communities. I think just handing everybody $200 to be a tourist, that's great. That's gonna, that'll help tourism operators get through this season, right? It'll help with the short-term emergency. It's not really taking advantage of the pause in the tourism economy right now to maybe say like, so personally, through a lot of my research, I've developed I think research-based opinion that I think the cruise industry is a fucking disaster and is not a good way of doing tourism. It for me falls on the very harmful end of the spectrum, socially and ecologically, and doesn't tend to bring a lot of benefit compared to slower forms of tourism that are more, where people come to experience in a more deeper way the culture and environments of places. So, if this thing actually drives a spike through the cruise sector for the next several years, I would not actually be sad. And hopefully that would give a chance for other forms of tourism to flourish and emerge, right? Or promote more slower forms of travel that, maybe we go less often, but we go for more quality, right? I can't see a way post-COVID that airfares are not going to go way up over the next few years. So I think we're going to have a rethink of what tourism looks like. And hopefully we can use that kind of parallel to the green recovery discourse around energy systems. Hopefully we can also use this as a chance to maybe re-envision tourism in ways that do bring, to use Zita's term, more dignity to the host and the guest, right? Yeah. And I suspect if anything gets tweeted out about this by calling the cruise industry like a fucking disaster that I wouldn't mind seeing a spike going through the heart of, I suspect that might be the Twitter bit that gets me into trouble.
Great stuff. Yeah, I really appreciate that input on the topic. I think it's something that not a lot of people consciously think about, or as you said, the actual governance and the decision-making process is going into.
And actually, on that note, I have a question for Catherine, actually, because the tourism sector is a pretty major global part of the global economy. So has it, like, to me, it's probably a less obvious part of the climate finance picture, but does it enter into the climate finance picture at all?
Well, I haven't, from what I've seen, no. Yeah. So most of the focus has been on production type activities.
Right.
And the supply chain industry. So there's a lot of focus on logistics. There's a lot of focus on heavy industry, advanced manufacturing.
Right.
Yeah, but tourism, not really.
Right. And yet at the consumption end, it's actually a pretty big contributor. And I think that goes to like what you often hear from tourism stakeholders that I very much agree with. It's, we often socially, we really under-recognize actually how economically important it is and how central it is actually. So it's, so I guess that's another example where it's maybe flying under the radar compared to its actual significance.
Yeah. And actually, parts of the tourism industry are very capital intensive, like airlines for one, cruise lines for another. And that's actually like, okay, so that's something that's pretty visible here, because I don't know if you know this, but many of these cruise liners are actually being built in Finland. and there's a big old industry of shipbuilding, traditional industry of shipbuilding, and one of the kinds of ships that they build these days are the Norwegian cruise liners or whatever, and there's a very interesting financing mechanism there because they are so expensive that even the cruise operators can't kind of take the whole risk by themselves. But because they are economically such big projects, the Finnish government is actually sharing the risk partly by these export credits with the cruise line industries. So actually, you know, and this is not just the current government, it's a system that's been set up for a long time, but the current government has not touched it. Despite their very sort of environmentally friendly image, they are still kind of spending a lot of money on these export credits to build cruise ships that are not great for the environment. So
yeah, that's a thing. Yeah, no, totally agree. I think that's the thing with these major industries and critical infrastructure, right? There's basically what was the way that one of the saying is that everyone's pension fund is in one of these or parts of their pension funds are embedded in these carbon intensive infrastructures and industries, and so there's a lot of locked in investments in this carbon intensive infrastructures and industries. So one of the discussions that's been had now in the sustainable finance space is how do we unlock our pension funds and our sovereign wealth funds from these carbon intensive sectors. And the thing is also these particular types of investors, the sovereign wealth funds and the pension funds, they invest for the long haul, right? So they're not so much pressured for short-term returns. They're looking at investments, equities that they can invest in for a long time, but also with lower risk of failure. Correct. So I think with the shift in oil prices and also with more and more public pressure for governments to invest more in green technologies or greener or low emissions fuels, that, for example, airlines or the shipping industry can use. There is more incentive for these big, large institutional investors that invest for the long haul to then gradually shift their assets out of these polluting fossil fuel intensive sectors to more sustainable ones.
Yeah, no, maybe just to draw the connection with movements there too, I think movements have been quite successful at creating that public pressure through things like divestment and things like that, to shift that funding stream, right? So probably one of the most notable success stories is probably the steps that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund has taken to divest from coal and from oil, so on. And I also found it interesting, like doing the oil tourism project in the North Atlantic. We've been working the last few years to kind of find out that like cities like Copenhagen and Oslo have largely, they've kind of very much embraced the logic of divestment. And these are cities where companies like Maersk and Statoil, which is now Equinor, are headquartered, right? Like they're kind of fossil fuel corporate kind of host cities. Yet because they've joined the ranks of the C40 kind of group, and because of public pressure around kind of a green self-image for the society, there's been some very positive and very effective kind of movement action at shifting those finance streams. Yeah. So yeah, if you can't change government policy, sometimes at least you can change the direction of the money, right? So, which I think Catherine's work is very important for illuminating for us. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the stream. We don't have that many participants. I think it's also a little bit of a indication of, yeah, a lot of things happening today with some preparations for protest, not protest. Yeah, I think we have some kind of, legal restrictions on protests. So I'm not really legally obliged to say we're organizing something today, but if you happen to go like on a bicycle or go for a walk, you might as well go around the government building, see what's up, and in other parts of Slovenia as well. Yeah.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, I think I've used it 2 times now since these Friday non-protests started. So yeah. So yeah, I think we could wrap it up here if we liked. I don't know, unless yeah, I know it's a bit funny to say this way, but like, do you really like to answer a question that you never get asked, or?
I think we've been chatting for a while, so I'm kind of feeling likewise like the time is kind of naturally coming to a close. So I would just say thank you to those who've joined, taken the time. Thank you, Rock, for organizing, and thank you both, Catherine and Tomas. It's awesome to see your faces and have some conversation, and yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, same here. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone. And I think it was a very fun conversation and a very useful conversation.
Yeah, we tried to keep it a bit light today, right? And yeah, we post these on our YouTube channel as well. We have an archive, and I'm sure it'll be very useful to refer back to in future as a kind of knowledge commons we're trying to build here.
Yeah, thanks Rock for organizing this, and Mark for inviting me to join this conversation. And I just want to apologize that I did not prepare for this because I didn't know it was happening. So excuse my rather I don't know, unstructured responses.
Yeah, I think my experience of the COVID webinars so far is the more casual and unstructured, the more interesting they've actually been.
Right.
So I think that was what I was hoping we would end up with.
Right. Okay. So I guess it worked out.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I'd be happy to follow up with all of you at some point. We're also kind of organizing internal talks to talk, different strategies and stuff like that. And input is always welcome also on those ends.
Right. So, and you mentioned sharing some resources. So for example, I mean, I actually have the project report from the Oil Tourism Interface project that I can definitely share openly with folks and all that.
Yeah, for sure. We'd like to link that with the videos so people can refer to some of this. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Thanks so much again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
See you next time.
See ya.